I was in an emotionally abusive relationship. I was in an unhealthy environment, realizing all of these things, and that it didn't have to be like that, was sort of coming to terms with the idea that up until that point, I don't know who I truly was, and I wish that I could have gotten to know myself at 16 years old, or 18 years old, and experienced life as myself, for myself, instead of constantly putting other people before myself and making my decisions based on how they would feel, not on what I wanted.
What is normal? When all we know are the experiences we had, it can be easy to think that the way we have been treated is all there is. As we get older and meet new people, and with the era of social media, which allows us to connect with more people than ever before, we get access to other people's experiences and information. For someone who has been chronically abused for years, this can lead to a very painful realization. And for many of us, those moments become the catalysts to begin our healing journeys. So what happens after you begin to realize that a lot of the ways you were treated were in fact not normal? I wish I had a simple answer to that very complicated question. This week, I have the delight of being joined by Casey Smith, host of Is Not Normal, a mental health podcast. In part 1 of our conversation, Casey and I will talk about the pain of realizing that the things we got accustomed to were not normal, the impact of podcasting in our healing journeys, the importance of self-compassion and curiosity, what healing without a professional therapist can look like, the complexities of going no contact with parents, the invisible effects of emotional abuse, and so much more. Hi, I am Raysa, a survivor of narcissistic abuse, and I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and you are listening to Hello Trauma Brain, a podcast where I share my experiences living with complex PTSD. My hope is this podcast can help destigmatize mental health and provide support for anyone diagnosed with CPTSD who thinks they might have it or has a loved one with this diagnosis. Quick reminder, I am not a licensed psychologist or mental health care professional, and this podcast is not meant to replace nor substitute the care of psychologists, other mental or medical health care professionals. If you think you might have complex PTSD or PTSD, please reach out to your primary care or mental health care provider. Any individuals or resources mentioned in this episode are not sponsoring Hello Trauma Brain. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by this week's guest are solely their own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Hello Trauma Brain and the host. This episode may reference trauma or abuse, and listener discretion is advised. Remember, you can always pause or skip this episode at any time. And now, let's get back to the episode. Hello, dear survivors, and welcome to this episode of Hello Trauma Brain. Thank you for joining me today. Quick check-in. It has been a very, very hard week. And ironically, when I recorded this interview, back then it was a hard week as well. And I was hoping that by the time this episode came out, things were settling a little bit more. And they did. And enough time has passed between that interview and now where yet another hard week has come my way. And all I will say about it is fall is considered peak narcissistic abuse season. And I will be talking a little bit more about that in an upcoming episode. But for now, I am exercising my best to try to remain as present, as grounded as I can be, and to sit with my feelings, dialogue. I just did a session, and I feel like it definitely helped me release some of the charge and the energy that I have been experiencing, and remind myself that in spite of everything that's happening that's completely out of my control, I still remain safe in terms of my internal space. Like, I have a lot more power than I used to, and I'm leaning towards that in order to help me navigate this time. So this week, I am delighted to finally share my conversation with Casey Smith. She is the host of Is Not Normal, a mental health podcast. I want to give a shout out to a very dear friend of mine, Anna Marie, for recommending Casey's Instagram page to me. Casey's content is so relatable, especially if you are a survivor of parental narcissistic abuse. Today, I will share part 1 of our conversation. Few things to note before we start. You might hear when I accidentally hit my microphone or Casey's dog hit hers, and there's nothing wrong with your device. Those sounds are coming from the pod. Also, we totally did not color coordinate on purpose. And I am mentioning this because for this particular interview, the video footage for this conversation will be available on the YouTube channel and also on Spotify. For those of you that are not aware of this yet, Spotify supports video podcasting now, so I'm gonna give it a shot and try that out and see how it works. So if you see the footage, you will notice that we literally have a very similar color shirt on. And again, not planned. I feel like if we would have tried to plan it, it probably would have not been that spot on. But anyway, a few more things. Leading up to the interview, I did have some technical difficulties. And when I began the conversation, my brain was still adjusting and going through a bit of an OCD moment of this should have been way more smooth than it is right now. I should have planned better. All that stuff was kind of running in the background. But Casey made it very easy to get back into the moment with her insights and wisdom. As usual, I do try to leave pauses during the interviews on purpose, and I invite you to join us as we reflect on the topics we talk about. Also, I left something we did before we got started, which is take a few deep breaths. The reason I am doing this is because I felt it was important to show and bring awareness to the fact that we are just two human beings coming together for this conversation, and we needed a moment to center ourselves, and I thought you might find helpful to see that part of our process. Now, without further delay, here is part 1 of my conversation with Casey Smith. Let's take another breath.
Yeah, nice big deep breath.
Yes. All right. Hello, dear survivors. I am so thrilled to introduce to you today Casey Smith. Casey is a 27-year-old creator and host of Is Not Normal, a mental health podcast. After realizing her trauma in her early 20s, it became clear to Casey how many unhealthy behaviors she had grown accustomed to and unknowingly integrating into her own life. Through research and reflection, Casey has embarked on her own healing journey and made a commitment to herself to unlearn the unhealthy to better understand herself and the world around her. In the time since, Casey has discovered a community that inspires her to share her story and all she has learned along the way. Thank you so much for joining me, Casey, for this conversation, and welcome to Hello Trauma Brain. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling great today, and I really appreciate you inviting me to be on your podcast. I'm really excited to talk with you.
Absolutely. I'm so thrilled you said yes. Full disclosure, I learned about you because a friend of mine sent me your Instagram page, the Insta for Big Sis Casey. And I saw one post and I was just like hooked. It's like, gosh, Casey gets it. And
That's awesome.
it's one of those things where my podcast is pretty small, so I tend to think I need more followers to be able to reach out to people. And you made a post a while back welcoming people to approach you, and it almost felt like cosmic. I was like, I think I can ask her. So I did, and I'm so glad you said yes. Welcome.
Oh, of course. I'm so glad that you saw that post too, because I get so many messages, and I sometimes have a hard time just going through all of them because I tend to hyperfixate over the things that I say and the words that I use. And sometimes just sending a message takes way longer than it needs to. Yeah. But I think especially, in talking about mental health and trauma, I always want people to know that like I am open, you know what I mean? And it might take me a little while, but I will totally read your message and get back to you, because I feel like numbers don't matter at all. You know what I mean? Especially when you're dealing with something like this. It's so much more about community and connection. And yeah, I'm so thrilled that you reached out.
Yeah, me too. I actually wanted to ask you first, since we're both podcasters and our content is centered around talking about our traumas and what happened to us in healing. How has podcasting and creating on social media impacted your healing journey so far?
Well, I think, in the beginning, I first started posting on TikTok without any real goal in mind in terms of, growing on social media or anything like that. I was just by myself in my truck, and I wanted to talk, I wanted to share. And so I was like, you know what? Let me just put this out there. And my goal, I guess, in the beginning was to be able to look back at that time in my life and see how far I had come, in a year's time or 2 years' time. And once I started to see that so many people were resonating with my stories, which up until that point, I had thought were sort of an isolated experience. I thought this was my life. These were things that happened to me. And I didn't know how much of a shared experience it was. And so once I saw that, it made me, I think, that much more determined and motivated to continue to learn. And I think for me, knowledge is power when it comes to healing, because understanding more about why I am the way that I am and these different things that I'm feeling and how to trace them back so that I can unlearn them, it does take away a lot of the power of this unhealthy behavior, these things that you can kind of sit with that make you really uncomfortable. Yeah. And so I think sharing on social media, not only has it sort of provided me with community, which is something that I think was lacking in my life for a long time, especially when it comes to mental health. But I think it was also kind of, even with the podcast, to sit down once a week and to talk about a subject in detail. It kind of prompts me to reflect on how I'm feeling, what's going on in my life that is, something maybe that I'm having a hard time with, or something that in the past was really challenging that now I'm noticing a change and, I'm handling it better. And, I think it's really important to allow space for self-reflection while we're healing, because then we can kind of see where we're at. We always have to check in with ourselves. I think as people who have survived trauma and endured that for so long, it can be so easy to kind of slip back into old patterns of behavior if you're not keeping yourself in check. Yeah. And so I think in that way, it's really kind of allowed me to hold myself accountable for these different things that I want to work on. And I think it's also been a challenge, balancing social media and other aspects of my life. It kind of brings to the surface like all of these different questions, because if I go to talk about something and it makes me uncomfortable, then I'm like, why? Why is that? And how can I continue to do this and also have that be sustainable in my life? It's teaching me to be patient with myself and to kind of allow myself a longer timeline than I used to in the past. I think I was always very much, if I said I was going to do something on this day, I'm going to do it. Otherwise, I feel really bad. And now I think, I'm understanding that I don't always have to check off all the boxes on my to-do list every single day. It's okay to be patient and to forgive myself if I don't get things done. And so it's been a really wonderful journey so far.
Wow, thank you for sharing, Casey. And I can hear how podcasting and reflecting and doing this work has created and increased the self-compassion you have for yourself. And I feel like a lot of us, when we start this journey, we're lacking that part. Like I can think of a time in my life where I was so hard on myself. Like when you were saying that I need to check every box, like, yes, like that perfectionism just gets activated as a way of like, for me, it's a way of like, if I can get it right and I can control it, then maybe the bad thing won't happen. And to learn to sit with, oh, I didn't check the 3 boxes. And today, as I sit here, nobody's coming after me for it. Like that's such a huge experience. Yeah.
I know. It's like everything is okay. And you can work on those 3 boxes today or tomorrow, believe it or not. But you have to give yourself permission to do that, you know?
Yeah. I find it fascinating, and I kind of want to point it out right off the bat. Like you're younger than me, and I feel like when people are healing, like there is no age limit for starting this work. You can start it in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, etc. And sometimes when I'm looking at your content, like my mind is just blown, because when I was in my 20s, like that was not in my radar at all. And I'm in awe of how far you've come, like in an early age. But I also want to hold space for the fact that you still went through a lot of trauma, and starting off earlier doesn't negate how much work you have to do. Like I'm just quite frankly fascinated for how you've done your healing. And I wanted to ask you, because you're the first guest that's going to come on the podcast that's doing healing without a professional therapist. Like as far as I've heard in your content, you've said that you've been reading books, and I know you did an interview with 2 therapists a few months ago. But I think so far, all my guests, including myself, we've done therapy. Either they're professionals in the field or survivors that have done some modality. And I love the idea of bringing you on and showing that example of you don't need to have a therapist. Like if you don't have access or the resources to have a professional, that doesn't mean you don't get to heal. You can do it. Like how has it been for you doing that healing process without the quote unquote the therapist in the room?
Right. Sorry.
You're okay.
Yeah, it's, therapy, I think, is such a wonderful thing. And there are people in my life who are in therapy, and I love having conversations with them about, the progress that they're making and how that's beneficial for them. Yeah. And it's definitely something that I would like to experience in the future. And I think, right now it's just because I don't have the resources, to seek out a therapist. And I think that is the case for a lot of people. I think it can be really challenging to seek out that kind of care. Yeah. And so I think one of the wonderful things about social media and about the internet in general is how many resources there are out there that are accessible to everyone. Yeah. And that has really been kind of the main thing for me. In addition to having my wonderful husband who is always willing to listen to me and to talk through these different problems. But I've read books, and in reading and in connecting with other people, if there's something that I read about or something that I hear and it brings something to the surface for me, I will dive into that topic, and I'll look specifically about, articles on that topic and other people's experiences with it, and understanding what I do now about my life. That sort of allows me to draw some connections between my personal trauma and the way that I'm feeling and this topic that I just learned about. Yep. And, you really can get very far, I think, in understanding yourself using resources online and using books, that therapists have written, because you may not have access directly one-on-one to a therapist, but there are so many people out there, mental health professionals who have written books, and they have these resources that are available for us that, I still sometimes, I'll go back and reference different books and, different sections that I highlighted that really just remind me of something, or, if I'm ever questioning something, because I think it's also very real to sort of gaslight yourself at times, and to feel distant from a version of yourself that was experiencing trauma. Yeah. And especially sharing on social media, it can kind of get in your head where it's like, oh, was it really that bad? And I feel like revisiting these different things and reading about them and reminding yourself that they're very real experiences, it's really helpful.
Yeah. I I agree. And I love that you bring that curiosity. Like when I hear you talk about how you approach your journey, there's a lot of curiosity. Something resonated. Let me look it up. Let me get the book. Let me get on social media or on Google and see what's out there about this. And does it resonate even more? Like, I think that is such a key component, whether or not you're doing therapy with a professional or not, like having that curiosity, because if that awareness is not there, it's really hard to work on something you're not aware that you're doing. And that I want to highlight that. Was it that bad? I feel like every trauma survivor that has suffered for a long time, that's something we are constantly asking ourselves. I do it myself. Like I'll take a test on the toxic family system I had, and they'll score 99 out of 100. And I can see it. It's right in front of me, the number. And I still go, oh, well, was I fair with the score? Maybe I should have given them, like, it wasn't every day. Like, maybe I shouldn't have said 5 on that one. And I find myself constantly needing to remind myself how bad it was. And it comes in the form of either people reminding me, or I sometimes have to listen back to my own podcast. I forget what I say. Like, I forget my own epiphanies, and I'm like, I'm listening to an old episode. I'm like, what? That's a thing. Does that happen to you? And do you listen back to your episodes? And
you know, I don't listen back to my episodes too much, but I have journals that I write in. And, you know, from the very beginning, when I first started sharing on social media and getting books and things like that, I would take notes, you know, and I would jot things down. And I do sometimes revisit my very first journal that I started with, and the realizations that I was having, just that I am my own person, not an extension of my parents. You know, now a year later, that's something that I understand, that I feel. And to feel like, you know, there was a time in my life not that long ago where something like that was foreign to me, where I didn't think that I was allowed to set boundaries, you know, things like that. And so I definitely do have to remind myself, because it can be easy, I think, as you move through your healing journey and time passes, to kind of start to create your own life outside of your trauma, you know, and as you distance yourself from those relationships and that environment, and you start to feel at home in a safe space, it's so much easier to lean into that sometimes, because it's like, this feels good and I feel good here, you know? And so I think revisiting, you know, either old podcast episodes or an old journal can be really helpful when we are experiencing sort of that self-gaslighting. And there was one other thing that I wanted to say there. Oh, yes. I saw a post on Reddit once, and someone was asking a similar question. And they said, you know, sometimes you have to reassure yourself, because throughout childhood, for some of us, I think we were conditioned to downplay a lot of really unhealthy behavior. And it was almost like we were told that it wasn't that bad or how good we have it. And I think our self-worth sometimes was tied to how good we can handle these really difficult things. And so the person was kind of saying that, you know, if you are struggling with this, look something up about the things that you've gone through, you know, and read about it to remind yourself that it is valid. Or if you have, you know, a conversation, a text conversation between you and someone, you know, your abuser or anything like that, something that really reminds you, you can revisit that however often you need to remind yourself that, you know what, that was bad, and getting myself out of that situation was the right thing to do.
Let me sit with that for a moment. There's so many good things in there. And right off the bat, gosh, there's so much. My brain is like computing right now. I love the idea. Let me start with the name of your podcast, because I really want to talk about that. It's not normal. It's not normal for people that are childhood trauma survivors. When you have been raised in a certain environment, that's all you know. That is the normal for you. And for me, like when I hear your podcast, I'm reminded of how I started realizing how not normal a lot of things works. I found that in support groups online. I was in support groups online, and I would hear people come on, and, you know, we all would get to share, and I would share my thing, and then somebody else would be sharing something, and I would go like, whoa, what? Like, what do you mean that's abusive? That happens to me every day. Like, I thought that was normal.
Right.
And when I would share, I could see the comments on the Zoom meeting of people being like, oh my gosh, that happened to me too. And those little moments when you realize, and I think that's why it's so important for us to hear the stories of other people. That's why your content is so important. And even like my little podcast is so important, because if nobody's talking about it, nobody realizes it's not normal. And
Exactly.
when I see your podcast, like I had a therapist who, we didn't get to do it, but she had offered me, she called it "It's Not Normal" sessions. And she's like, you can throw at me things that happened to you in childhood, and I can tell you if it's normal or not. And for budget reasons, we couldn't continue together our work, but I still think of that often. And yeah, I have to say, like, what brought you to name your podcast "Is Not Normal"? Because I love it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was honestly accidental. I didn't really like sit down and think, okay, I have to come up with a name for this podcast.
Yeah.
I just found myself sharing on social media, these different things that I was learning. And I would start off some of my videos with, it is not normal for your parent to do X, Y, and Z. And I think, one of the captions, I was like, on today's episode of It's Not Normal, just kind of like as a joke, I guess. And then when I was deciding to start a podcast, my husband did suggest, he was like, that's not a bad name for a podcast, because that's what you're going to be talking about, all of these different behaviors. And, it did make sense. And I think it was always important for me in naming the podcast to have it be broad enough where I could talk about, not just narcissism, but other things also. Because I think there are a lot of different aspects of our lives that contribute to our mental health that aren't necessarily normal, and I would love to kind of expand and get into that over time. Yeah. But I think it also does, like you said, it serves as a great reminder, weekly, that these things that so many of us have grown accustomed to are not in fact normal. They're not things that just because we've grown accustomed to, we have to deal with for the rest of our lives, And yeah, so it was kind of a coincidence, I guess.
Yeah, I just want to highlight that phrase you said. Just because you are accustomed to them doesn't mean you have to deal with them for the rest of your life.
Exactly. And like you said, if people aren't talking about it, then there's no way that anyone's ever going to know. Because I think when you grow up in that kind of toxic family system, you can feel so isolated and you don't have a lot of outside perspective. And I think it's so easy to think, well, okay, this is just the way that my parents are, and it's my responsibility to deal with them and to make the best of this. But once you start to realize that there's part of it that are maybe your parents' characteristics and their personality, but then there are other behaviors that so many people display that are unhealthy. Yeah. That, I think, is when you can sort of take a step back and realize, okay, this isn't just my mom and dad. You know what I mean? This is gaslighting. And this is something that people who are emotionally immature or manipulative do to people for a reason. I think coming to terms with that and understanding that allows you to distance yourself a little bit from the relationship itself and to not take things so personally.
Yeah. I want to dive in a little bit more into this, because this is a huge taboo, this whole setting boundaries with the parents. And I remember using this. I used to lead support group meetings for a bit, and I used to tell some of the people that had the parent situation, take out the title. Switch mom and dad for abuser and say that statement again. Because it really, like, calling it what it is really important to understand what you're dealing with. And I think I'm pro going no contact if that is what you need. I have a, that definitely touches the nerve when I hear people go, but it's your mom, but it's your dad, but they're getting old. Like, it's absurd to ask a survivor of trauma to go back to their abuser, doesn't matter who they are. And in your case, you're open about the boundaries being set with your parents. I want to ask you, how are you coping with that no contact decision right now? How is that feeling for you? And how has it changed your life?
Um, so it's been a little over a year now that I've been no contact with my parents. And, even before then, our relationship was very up and down, and there would be periods where we didn't talk for very long. And then, times when we did talk. But before before realizing all of this, I would just kind of be in those moments and still not feel like I could fully be myself. And, I understand now that I didn't feel like I could be my true self for a number of different reasons. But I think, you know, going no contact for me has allowed me the space to really start to get to know who I am and who I am in a safe space. And that I think has been instrumental in healing overall. I think it's different for everyone, but for me personally, I didn't feel like I would be able to maintain any sort of a relationship with my parents and also become myself, sort of by myself, because they were so influential in my life, obviously, as I think so many parents are, that it's so easy to just slip right back into that people pleasing nature and fall back into sort of your old ways because that's all that you know with them, and if they are not open to sort of doing the emotional work to become more emotionally mature or to be okay with your boundaries, then it's kind of like all the work that you do behind the scenes when you're with them, it's like that's off the table. You can't expect them to participate or to make you feel comfortable. And it wasn't sustainable, for me anymore. And I think over the course of this past year, I felt so many different emotions about it. I think there have been times where I felt really sad that we don't have the relationship that I always thought we would growing up, or even the fact that maybe they may not do the emotional work in their lives to experience the world in a healthier way. I think a lot of times childhood trauma survivors do hold compassion for their parents because once you start to heal and understand how nice it feels to regulate your nervous system and to have these really safe, healthy relationships, you can want the same thing for your parents, but to sit with the feeling, I guess the powerlessness of knowing that there's nothing you can do to actually get them there is really challenging. Yeah. And so there's been sadness, there's been anger when someone in my life sort of reaches this milestone moment and I see a comment from my parent on their Facebook congratulating them. And I feel like, where is that for me? I want that too. Yeah. But then I think there are also moments of clarity and joy, to have grown up in that kind of environment and then to reflect on how far I've come, and to kind of look at it more in a way where I allow myself to be proud of myself, despite all of this unhealthy behavior that I grew up around, like I'm doing this thing and I'm really proud for that because it's hard, so it is a spectrum of emotions, but I think overall it's been a positive experience for me as an individual.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate you so much for sharing what your experience has been, Casey. And I want to start off by saying I'm so proud of you.
Thank you.
I truly is not an easy thing to do. I'm going to be going on, is it 3? No. It was going to be like the end of my second year going no contact in November. Mm. And a lot of the things you were saying were resonating with me. And I want to highlight that concept of being ourselves. Because I found in my experience that I couldn't be my true self in order to make that relationship work. And that's why I had to step away. And I'm 36. So I have been discovering things about myself that I probably should have discovered back when I was in my early teens. And there is a lot of grief. I want to focus on that part, like you were talking about that sadness and that anger, and there's so much like I call it complex grief. That's the term that's coming to my mind right now, because it's a grief for yourself, it's a grief for what you are never gonna get, the things that you can't go back in time and get, a grief for them, and the fact that they don't get to enjoy the benefits of healing because they're not doing the work, and This is something that's bringing to my mind a recent post I saw on Instagram. I'm going to butcher this guy's name. I think it's David Keller. I want to make an episode on this because he was talking to Dr. Ramani Durvasula, and he's a grief expert. And he has a book out, and I'm butchering this because I don't have the info with me. I think it's called Finding Meaning. Mm-hmm. And if it's wrong, I will link the right stuff in the show notes for everyone listening. I promise. I will go back and fix this. It's completely impromptu over here. But David was talking about how when you are in a narcissistic relationship, you're grieving the death of yourself. Wow. And that is the one death that you can come back from.
Yeah. Wow.
That hit me so hard.
Yeah.
Because that's what it is.
You're so right. I think, one of the hardest things for me to reconcile once I started to realize that, I was in an emotionally abusive relationship. I was in an unhealthy environment, realizing all of these things, and that it didn't have to be like that, was sort of coming to terms with the idea that up until that point, I don't know who I truly was, and I wish that I could have gotten to know myself at 16 years old, or 18 years old, and experience life as myself, for myself, instead of constantly putting other people before myself and making my decisions based on how they would feel, not on what I wanted. And, I think it's even just small things, just allowing yourself to feel comfortable in an environment and to discover yourself, to try things, to say things, to, make mistakes. And maybe you have this new interest that you just want to try, and maybe it's silly, but you go ahead and do it anyway. I feel like growing up with emotionally immature parents, there's not a lot of space for that, because you always feel like you're being watched and scrutinized, and you never want to make a mistake or do anything wrong. And so there's this constant pursuit of perfection and this hypervigilance that are so suffocating. And I think, understanding and realizing, like, for me, it was like, it might be silly to some people, but it's like, I never got to go to my friend's Sweet 16, and I'll never get to go to one. I'll never get to do all of these things that other people, my peers, did get to do. And that took a while for me to kind of sit with, and understand, like, that so much of my life was just consumed by this. But at the same time, it's all about your perception and how you look at it. And on one side of the coin, you can feel grief for this. And I think it's important to acknowledge that grief and to validate it. Yeah. But I think it's also important to not let that overtake you, and to realize, what? Yes, that sucks that happened. But I'm here now, I'm realizing it, and I'm going to make the best of it for as long as I can, because there are people like our parents or, other abusers that will not do the work in their lives, and they may never get to experience what life is like as you start to heal. And so, as difficult as it can be, I think it also can make you that much more appreciative of the life that you're living now.
Casey, you're hitting the nail so many times. I wish I had my microphone nearby so I could drop it, and I cannot drop this one right now.
Thank you.
I want to say something. I don't think it's silly. I think those little things, not being able to go to your friend's Sweet 16, not being able to hang out with your friends when they show up at your doorstep impromptu, not having those little things, they're a big deal. They're a big deal because they're part of our development. And this is the part where, like, I wish I had magical words and, like, a machine that would make people understand it, the people that don't get it. Like, this is as basic and crucial as feeding your kid, as putting a roof over their head. Like, if somebody says, I didn't get fed, I was outside with a leash under, like, around my neck, and I didn't have any clothes, child services steps in and takes the kid away. And emotional abuse is just as bad.
I know.
It's the same effects.
But it's invisible so often. And I think that's one of the really difficult things. And one of the things that makes realizing our trauma that much more confusing is to feel like our physical needs were met. Because that was actually something I read. I think it was in Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by Lindsay Gibson. And she was talking about how confusing it can be to feel like, well, I had a roof over my head and clothes on my back, and all of my physical needs were met. Even maybe when I was sick, my parents took care of me. They gave me the medicine that I needed. Right. And so how do you sit with that and feel like, well, I have it better than a lot of other people, right? And on the surface, all of these things that show me that my parents care are there. But at the same time, there's this emotional loneliness that sometimes until you're older, you can't even put your finger on, until maybe you start to learn about it and understand that there are multiple components to a relationship between a parent and a child. And it's not just the physical needs. There's the emotional needs that are so important for development. And they really do shape our outlook on relationships in our adult life, both romantic and platonic. And, it can sort of feed into so many different aspects of our self-worth. And it all starts, I think, in childhood. And that's why it's so important. But it's invisible. And I think especially when you're dealing specifically with a narcissistic parent, they are so good at maintaining that image, at hiding it, and being so charismatic and outgoing to people outside of their immediate family that, I was told by teachers and friends, oh my gosh, your parents are awesome. You know what I mean? You guys are like the family, like you're so lucky to have them. Yeah. And so you have your physical needs being met, and you're being told maybe by your parents, that you have it so much better than other people. And then there are people outside of your immediate family that are reinforcing that narrative on top of the whole social aspect of, oh, your parents want what's best for you. They care about you the most. It's so confusing. You never even think to question their motives or to think like, oh, well, this is wrong. And then once you do realize that it's wrong, it's like, what? The rug is completely pulled out from under you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so destabilizing. And it's really an identity crisis when you reach that point, when you realize it. Because something that I've heard, Patrick Tehan talks about this, and one of my therapists has talked about this, is like, you start giving them medals for basics. That showing up for the singing stuff, showing up for, I did show up to school with a clean uniform, and, I had brand new sneakers on every school year when it started. Like that, giving them medals for that. So the abuse was justified. That's how you survive in there. That's why to me, and if anyone is still in relationship with the people in your lives that are toxic, narcissistic, abusive, you can insert the term that applies to you here. I want you to know, like, this is not to shame you. Like, I understand these relationships are complicated. Some people have to stay. It's hard. It's hard to set the no contact boundary. That, for me, that was like a last resort. That's not usually where people go first. But I think the reason I wanna highlight, and I think it's good to hear the stories about the no contact, is because we need to start normalizing that as an option. Like, I think the time of shaming people for going no contact with a parent needs to really end, because you hit it on the nail earlier. It looks good on the outside. It might look good on the outside for people, but what's happening behind closed doors is destroying a life. And it's not fair to hold anyone accountable or force someone to stay in there just because you think it looks good on the outside, and admitting that that could happen to somebody else is going to burst the illusion of the world is perfect. I think for us as survivors, like, coming to terms with that and reducing, and I mean, I want to decimate the shame that comes from it is so important, because we do have a right to develop. We do have a right to get to know ourselves, and asking to be treated with respect, civility, kindness. Like, I'll speak for myself here. I'm not asking for a lot. I'm really not asking for a lot. And it's my right to set the boundaries that I need to be able to feel good as a human being every day with the people that I'm interacting with. And something that you pointed out, like that, those emotional needs, I think they're so important for development as well. And I get that maybe, I don't know how long ago that wasn't on the radar, but I feel like a big part for healing is taking in new information. I know I'm fucking shit up. I know I'm saying stuff in this podcast that maybe in 2 years I'm going to have to come on and say, by the way, episode number 23, I'm wrong. I was so wrong. And something that I find with the parents that are on the other side of estrangement is that doubling down, like not being able to take the information, not being able to do the repair work. Like that's really what at the end of the day matters to me. Like I'm not asking for I never asked for the perfect person in my life. Doing that abuse, like when you abuse someone and you don't realize it, but then you learn it later. Saying I'm sorry and actually doing something to change the behavior and grow and not the I'm sorry you felt that way. Like I'm talking about a true, sincere apology where you understand the impact you had on someone.
Exactly.
And that it can't happen again.
You're exactly right. And, you know, in one of the books that I read, the author sort of broke down the difference between an apology and making amends. And, you know, an apology can be something so simple, so surface level that really leaves you feeling empty, but maybe the other person feels like because they said the words, I'm sorry, that they've fixed it. Yeah. But, you know, making amends, there's an effort there to understand how you made the other person feel. And then there's an effort to change your actions to make sure that you don't do the same thing again. Yeah. And I think, you know, when you're dealing with an emotionally immature parent or a narcissistic parent, an abuser in any way, I think it's all about accountability and empathy. Yeah. You know, I think everyone has things in their past that are going to affect the way that they show up in relationships and in friendships, and they may not always do the right thing. And, you know, that was something that I experienced firsthand. You know, when I first met my husband in the early stages of our relationship, I still had not yet realized my trauma. And so looking back, I can see that I was mimicking the behaviors that I grew up around. I was expecting hypervigilance from my partner. I was expecting him to read my mind. You know, all of these different things. I was passive aggressive and defensive if we would ever disagree because I didn't know that I could directly communicate. And, you know, it's one thing to do those things. And I think it's another thing to do them and then to realize that it's wrong, understand why, and then to be able to stand up and say, hey, I know that what I did in the past was wrong, and I'm really sorry about it, and I'm going to make an effort to change. And I think it requires both accountability and empathy. And I think empathy is something that emotionally immature parents lack because they are so self-focused. Yeah. And so it's sort of impossible for them to take a step back and say, well, maybe something that I did is the reason for this. You know, I think everything feels like such a personal attack. Yeah. And sometimes it can just be a conversation and say, you know, what you did here, like it was wrong and it didn't make me feel very good. So can we talk about it? And it can be as simple as that, you know. I think understanding that we all sort of come from our own unique backgrounds, and chances are a lot of us have dealt with something unhealthy, right? That might fuel our behavior is really important because then we can self-reflect and we can make amends for the people in our lives who are important to us, who we care about. Yeah. And I think, you know, for a lot of survivors, being on the receiving end of that kind of abuse and that kind of unhealthy behavior, at least, you know, for me, it makes me that much more motivated to not treat the people in my life that I care about in that way, because I know how it feels. And, you know, coming to terms with the idea that there was a time in my life when I displayed those same unhealthy behaviors was so uncomfortable and so challenging. And I think that is the discomfort that sometimes it can be so easy for people to walk away from because it's like, no, I didn't do that. Or like, there had to have been something else. You know what I mean? This isn't my fault. But you have to sit with it. You have to sit with that discomfort and understand that you can do what you can to make amends. Some people may be open to it. Some may not. And either way, that's okay. You know, it takes a lot of courage to do that, but it's so crucial, I think, to healing.
Hello, dear survivors. I hope you have enjoyed part 1 of my conversation with Casey Smith. We invite you to join us next week for part 2, as Casey and I dive deeper into the identity crisis of survivors of narcissistic abuse, untangling the shame of having behaved like our abusers too, hypervigilance, the power of relational healing, feeling seen and heard, learning to communicate in healthier ways, and so much more. I will be linking Casey Smith's podcast and all her information to the show notes, and I invite you to check out her content to add as a tool for your continuing healing journey. In this week's healing invitation, I want to offer you a few things to reflect about. Was there anything during my conversation with Casey that resonated with you? If you often find yourself doubting your experiences or minimizing the impact they had on you, I invite you to seek community, to start learning what is normal and what is not. Listening to this content and Casey's podcast can be a place to get started, to learn a bit more about what experiences were actually not as normal as you were led to believe. It can be a hard thing to face, but when you begin untangling and understanding the reality of your experiences, it can offer valuable information on things that need to be healed in order to improve the quality of your life. Also, I want to invite you to share in the comment section of this episode. And this is a friendly reminder that both YouTube and Spotify allow for comments on each episode to share your experience on part 1 of this conversation. You are so welcome to return next week for a special healing invitation inspired by this week's guest, Casey Smith. Please let me know how this week's healing invitation goes if you choose to accept it. Before we wrap up this episode, all music and production is courtesy of yours truly. Also, I want to share a few ways you can support this podcast to reach more survivors that could benefit from finding this content. You can subscribe and leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or the platform you are using to listen. Share this episode with anyone you think can find this content helpful. Follow Hello Trauma Brain on Instagram, subscribe to the Hello Trauma Brain YouTube channel, and hit the notification bell to be the first to know when I post a new episode. Also, you can make a donation via PayPal. No worries, all links will be provided in the show notes. Thank you for joining me and Casey today. We hope you found this episode helpful. We wish you the best as you navigate understanding what is normal and what is not. It is time for our farewell affirmations. I invite you to repeat after me. I welcome the belief that I am enough. I am lovable. And I deserve to heal. I wish you a gentle week and thank you for your presence.